So one question asks, what about a person without faith, an atheist, who seems to pour themselves out selflessly in various works of charity, of idealism, of helping others? What should we think about that? Well, we see the outside, God sees the inside. And so we can't know from the outside. We can't pronounce, oh yes, they have baptism of desire, or oh no, they don't. It depends if they have these conditions. So if they're invincibly ignorant, and that means that they're seeking, but they weren't able to find because of obstacles, and the obstacles could be, it was presented very badly to them, their family condition, whatever it may be. So there could be invincible ignorance. If there's true sorrow for sin as known in conscience, and if there's some kind of faith in something that perhaps they don't call God, but is God, like love or goodness or truth, it can be that they have baptism of desire. Absolutely it can be. But God only knows.
But how would they have perfect contrition for sin? They may not know that such and such a thing is a sin.
Okay. One of the conditions for mortal sin is that there be full knowledge. Right? So there are three conditions: grave matter, full knowledge, and full deliberation and consent. Now, full knowledge means that you understood in conscience that this was gravely wrong. It may be you're resisting that, but there's something inside you protesting. That would, if that's not the case, right? If you simply have no idea that this is wrong and there's nothing inside you, let's take some examples. Abraham committed some things that are grave matter, polygamy, with trying to realize God's promise with Hagar. But clearly, Abraham walked with God and was ignorant, it seems, invincibly ignorant of the evil of polygamy. So yes, so in such a case, the person doesn't have to make an act of perfect contrition for that, because they don't recognize that to be a sin. It's different in case of murder. Nobody's invincibly ignorant of the evil of murder or terrorism. Right? Terrorism, again, killing an innocent child or simply anyone who's innocent for no matter what cause, directly, is something that conscience will always protest against. But so it depends on what the sin is. Right? So yes, a person who doesn't know God can have perfect contrition for all the sins that they're able to recognize. The difficulty is the perfect part, because that's out of the motive of love. And so in order to be sorry for sin because of love for God, you've got to know God in some way. And you've got to not just know Him, but love Him. And that's, again, why it's so important that we spread the gospel. Because it's so much more difficult for people to love God if God hasn't been rightly presented to them. If God is presented, as in, say, the Aztec religion, or in any pagan religion involving human sacrifice, God doesn't seem lovable.
Well, but could they know? Because deep down you know there's a goodness there.
Right.
You know this.
Okay. Well, then, sure.
Know how you know it, but you know.
That's right. Exactly, and it's through grace.
Could they know that God
Absolutely, they could.
that goodness and not know it's God?
Excellent, fantastic. Yes, absolutely. And that is absolutely, and that because this desire for baptism isn't a merely human thing. Nobody can be saved by a merely human thing. It's got to be God's initiative through grace. And we're corresponding with that grace. And yes, it can happen. I was an atheist growing up. I have no idea what my interior condition was. But I think looking back at my childhood and my teen years, that there were times in which, even though I didn't know God, I desired to love Him and did have that. And then there were other times when one drifted away. So yes, absolutely, it is possible. And it's really important that we hold that it's possible, because otherwise, God's goodness is that it's crucial that God gives sufficient grace to every human being to be saved. Right? That's his universal salvific will. And one of the aspects of, say, Calvinism that is most harmful to having the right idea of God is the idea that God doesn't give sufficient grace to all to be saved. Right? That's terrible. And the same thing was true of the Jansenist heresy. They took that from Calvinism, the idea that God doesn't give sufficient grace to all to be saved. Yeah. Right? That's blasphemous. Okay. Did the people who received Christ's baptism before his death and resurrection still benefit from the death and resurrection even though it hadn't happened yet? Absolutely. Great question. From the beginning of the world, Abel benefited from Christ's passion. Because Abel offered a sacrifice pleasing to God. No, Cain didn't. Abel did. How was Abel able to offer a sacrifice pleasing to God? Only through the grace of God. Right? Because we can't do something salvific without the grace of God coming first. Well, where did the grace of God come from with regard to Abel? From Christ. From Christ meriting it thousands of years later on Calvary, but foreseen by God, because everything is present to God. And so in God's eternal plan, Christ's sacrifice is eternally present. And so its merits and fruits could be applied from the beginning of the world. So Abel was saved and received grace through Christ. Adam and Eve repented and did penance for, 800 years or however long they lived, through the grace merited by Christ on Calvary. Abraham was called and responded in faith through the grace merited by Christ on Calvary. And we could go through all the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Benjamin and Moses. All of them were pleasing to God through the grace merited by Christ on Calvary and given to them in advance. Mm-hmm.
And was he just a soul for just his soul?
No, because his soul wasn't yet created. So when Abel received the grace to offer pleasing sacrifice to God, Christ's soul doesn't yet exist.
No, but
is it?
Here's Abel got murdered.
Right?
And his soul, he was a soul.
Oh, afterwards.
For years and years.
That's right.
And where was he?
Okay, the limbo of... Good question. That's not a bad question. We call theologians... Well, Jesus speaks about it in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man as the bosom of Abraham. Okay, at Abel's time, Abraham didn't yet exist, and it wasn't yet his bosom. But it would be the limbo of the just. And that expression, limbo of the just, means the place where the souls of those who died in the grace of God reposed in peace, but were not yet able to see God face to face. It was a long, long wait. Thousands and thousands of years. But Abel had to receive that grace before death so that he could be sanctified, because we said that you've got to get grace before you die so that you can get into the limbo of the just. Right? So yes, it's retroactive in its effect. And another beautiful example of that retroactive effect, the grace by which Mary was immaculately conceived was merited by her son on Calvary. The grace by which John the Baptist was sanctified in the womb, merited by Christ on Calvary. Okay. And we could say the grace applied in circumcision to all the faithful of Israel, merited by Christ on Calvary. Right? And that's why Jesus says, no one goes to the Father except through me. And that's not just starting then, but for all of human history from the beginning to the end. They may not know it, implicit baptism of desire, but it's always through Christ. Great. Why wouldn't the aborted baby be considered similar to the holy innocents, baptism by blood? Well, we simply don't know. Baptism of blood is understood to be explicitly killed out of hatred for Christ. In other words, or God's law, it could be. So baptism of blood is when someone's killed out of hatred for God, Christ, Christianity, or the law of God. Now, it doesn't seem that abortion is directly that. If it is that, then it would be baptism of blood.
Why isn't it against the will of God?
It's definitely against the will of God, but it's not done. Abortion isn't directly a persecution of the church or a persecution of someone because they're a Christian. Yeah. Now, I don't know this, right? I can't pronounce whether it is or it isn't. It's just that it's not. All I'm saying is that it's not clear that it is, and we can't say that it's clear that it is. We can't say it's certain that every aborted baby goes directly to heaven by baptism of blood. We don't know.
So would it be going back to saying that it was someone doing it because they were persecuting the church, would it be the abortionist thinking that, or the
It wouldn't matter.
baby, or would it matter? It wouldn't matter.
Right, it wouldn't matter if the parent or the abortionist or whoever. We don't. That would be. Obviously, I would want to think that it is, but I don't think that we can claim that certain knowledge. Those who receive baptism as an infant receive the supernatural virtues, but can't do the acts until they get to the age of reason. They can't act on those virtues. But what about some of the saints who showed heroic virtue at an early age? For example, Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, who recognized Christ at an early age when exposed to the Blessed Sacrament, and gave his shoes away when a poor child had no shoes. He was 3 or 4 years old. Is that an example of virtue as in habitual form? No, I would say that's something more. We read in the lives of Padre Pio also. At a very young age, he talks about doing things that, and other saints as well. Anyway, there not a few saints have done these things, and that would be simply actual grace that can enable children to act above their age, to have a maturity more than is normal for their years. Right? So God can do that. But that wouldn't simply be habitual, because that's already an act. And of course, if God can do something like that, He can arouse in a child a desire for baptism, even though the child is what we would consider normally too young. God can do that in His grace. The point is that would be extraordinary and not an ordinary means. One of the criticisms of the church or the Mass is that it's not feeding me. People say that. However, it seems that the real problem is a lack of participation by those of us at Mass. Right? In other words, when somebody thinks they're not being fed at Mass, that's a sign that they're not participating interiorly. In other words, probably they have no idea what's going on, tragically. And the fault for that is so often a poor catechesis. Right? They weren't taught what's going on. Because if we recognize that what's going on at Mass, we'll have a talk on that, but what's going on at Mass is Calvary. Calvary is going on at Mass. God made man is offering Himself on the altar for me and for you. And is being sacramentally immolated out of love for us, so that He can then give Himself entirely to us in communion. All right, if I think, well, I'm not being fed, it's because probably I don't believe what's happening. And perhaps I don't believe it because I wasn't taught it. So this is our job, right? to make that known, what's happening, or at least an inkling. I mean, if we could have the smallest inkling of what's going on, we would just, yeah, exactly, we would be blown over. Why is original sin still passed on to the next generation, even through baptized parents? Good question. So the fact that the parents are baptized doesn't mean that they're able to transmit an unfallen human nature. All of us get our human nature from Adam. And so all of us get our human nature with the penalty for the fall was that all those to whom Adam was going to pass on that human nature by human generation were going to receive it without these gifts. And so it doesn't matter whether the parents are baptized or unbaptized. Everyone conceived by natural generation receives human nature stripped of the gifts that God enriched it in Eden. And so the baptism of our parents doesn't affect that the children are born with original sin or not. Now, Calvin thought otherwise. Calvin apparently thought that the children of the baptized could pass on that salvation. This goes together with the once saved, always saved idea. But clearly that can't be the case. And so even though the parents are baptized, the children need baptism to remedy the loss of original, the penalty of original sin. Christ tells us to store up treasures in heaven. If a person delays baptism till their later years, will that have an effect on our ability to store those treasures? Absolutely. Fantastic question. In other words, what does that mean, to store up treasures for heaven? Jesus is talking about merits. Now, again, that's something unpopular for Protestants. But so many places of the Gospels talk about merits using different kinds of metaphors or language. Storing up treasures for heaven is clearly the merits of good works. But in order for good works to have merit, they have to be done in Jesus, in his divine life. In other words, in a state of grace and motivated by charity. That's what makes a work meritorious, is it's done in a state of grace, moved by charity. So every work done by someone who's in a state of grace, motivated by charity, is meritorious and is storing up treasures in heaven. Now, if somebody delays baptism, that would be crazy because I'd be delaying receiving that divine life and I'd be delaying the very ability to merit. So Constantine made a very poor calculation. I'm sorry, I'm picking on him for this. By waiting till his deathbed to be baptized. Because it's true, he was freed from purgatory, but he was also freed from merit in the sense of he didn't have the opportunity of meriting. Because to merit, you've got to be in Christ. Right? So he came out small. It's true, he didn't have to suffer, but he didn't have the possibility of a whole life rich in merits. And that's what God gives us and wants from us is that, so many of the parables talk about that. The parable of the talents. Right? So he gives us these various talents so that we double them or quintuple them. And that's precisely storing up treasures in heaven through doing works out of charity. But we can only do works out of charity if we're in Christ and make use of the sacramental means.
So is that real happy fault? The fact that we're able to merit?
Right. That's right. In Eden, it would seem like the only merit would be persevering. But they couldn't merit as we do that in a way that involves difficulty and sacrificial love. Right? The difficulty with which, in other words, the fact that in order to do a work of charity, I have to overcome obstacles, and sometimes very considerable obstacles. That's what makes that act of charity more meritorious. So in that sense, yes, it's a happy fall, because we can, the fall, because it enables us to participate with the most glorious thing in all of creation, and that's Christ's redemptive suffering out of love. Great. One last question. What's the... this came up in a conversation in the break. If baptism of desire is possible, it can win salvation, well, what's the advantage in getting sacramental baptism? The sacramental baptism gives something more than baptism of desire. Character, right. So the answer is yes. It gives more than, and the first thing it gives more is character. Baptism of desire doesn't give character. And that means somebody who has baptism of desire, they're not a member of the church. They're not visibly joined into Christ's mystical body. They're still outside. They're longing to be inside. They will be inside if they die with that desire. Right? They'll be in the church triumphant, but they're not in the church militant. And that's tragic, because it means that they're missing out on all the other means and glories of being in the church militant. For example, receiving the Eucharist, receiving the sacrament of penance, receiving all the sacraments. And then another thing is that in order to have baptism of desire, for it to be efficacious, there's got to be perfect contrition. In order to receive the sacrament of baptism, it's enough to have imperfect contrition. So the bar is higher for baptism of desire. Now that's part of God's mercy. It's not fair, it's true. But God's gratuitous gifts don't have to be perfectly fair. He gives them where He wills. And those of us who have the good fortune to receive them in the church have to be thankful for them. And then the third difference is that baptism of desire doesn't take away the temporal punishment for sin. They'll still have to do it in purgatory. But baptism sacrament does. But of course you'll get temporal punishment for sins done after baptism. All right, any questions on that? All right, I've run out of questions.